Action movies. There was a time, before adaptations of heroes in spandex became vogue, where there would be one or two high-octane action films per year, filled with memorable one-liners spoken by square-jawed muscle freaks. And while yes, the nature of such films have somewhat changed over time, some of the older ones have stood the test of time to become classics of the genre. And at the intersection of wanton mayhem, gleeful carnage, and memorable points of dialogue stands one man in particular. A man who has come to epitomize the concept of action movies for decades. From the somewhat absurdly allegorical,
"But I hope you leave enough room for my fist, because I'm going to ram it into your stomach and break your goddamn spine!"
to the slightly more serious.
I'll be back.
And it is here that a scene unfolds which typifies the glorious chaos we have come to associate with the genre. There's something almost thrilling about watching a scene like this played out, where the audience is helplessly transfixed by the display of visceral, unrepressed, overwhelming violence. Though there is a certain sense of irony and poetic justice in seeing abject violence being dealt to a group of people who themselves have a disturbing habit of violently repressing, terrorizing, and slaughtering people, especially those of certain demographics and ethnicities, but I digress. You watch this grim display, this symphony of strife, a pinnacle upon which the movie has earned much of its acclaim. Then you look again at the title of the video you're watching and you go, wait, what? Let me explain. If you take a look at the general structure, 1984's The Terminator seems to have all the general components of the typical action movie of the 80s/90s. The hero, the damsel, the villain, the mission. But in spite of this, there appears to be some incongruity where this setup is concerned. After all, Kyle Reese isn't exactly framed as a stereotypical hero, and certainly isn't portrayed as the protagonist for that matter. Rather, Sarah Connor, the veritable damsel to be rescued, is actually the primary focus of the plot. And the villain? Rather than being some Machiavellian mastermind, the titular Terminator is an emotionless personification of cold, calculated violence. And the deeper you look at all the details, the stranger it seems for them to have diverted so much from the usual tropes. Now, to showcase precisely what I mean, let's look at a few clips. Arnold's character, the Terminator, gets a chest full of shotgun while trying to kill Sarah at the club. And another, and you begin to get the impression, especially after Arnold gets up again after all that this guy definitely isn't a normal human being. Beyond any exposition that takes place, it begins to finally sink in once he's back in the apartment, and you see him cutting into his own skin, flaying his arm open in a gruesome display to reveal the wet, living flesh within, encasing hard steel and machinery, and soon after, he gouges the flesh of his face, dragging a disfigured and dripping eye out of its socket, under which lies red-stained chrome encasing a small camera, itself dimly glowing red. What did you feel the first time you saw that? Disgusted? Horrified? Unsettled? Alienated? And this feeling, which was slowly manifesting up to this point, only continues to grow and gestate as various narrative elements reinforce it, right up to the point where all pretense at humanity is, quite literally, burned away. And then you fully realize that the flesh, the voice, the words, they were all a lie. an approximation of human characteristics, just accurate enough to give you a sense of dissociation and anxiety when it's all stripped away. Much like Kyle Reese himself says,
"Listen and understand that Terminator is out there. It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear. And it absolutely will not stop. Ever. Until you are dead."
With all this, the Terminator seems less to me like a strict action movie, and more so one where the action is used as a delivery mechanism for emotions both subtle and profound. A sense of terror from the thought of facing a presence which cannot be reasoned with, and will not stop hunting you until either you or it is dead. The sense of foreboding, ever-growing and constant, that the very normal, very human reality to which you have grown accustomed could be inverted and twisted into something grotesque, yet vaguely, disgustingly familiar. And in a way, it gives a much deeper sense of gravity to the scene at the precinct. Police officers, who stand as both a symbol of authority and a tool of sanctioned violence and oppressive force, are themselves oppressed by a violent force they cannot hope to overcome. After all, the threat of violence, brutal authority and death are all the police really have to rely on. So what happens when they face something against which their authority doesn't work? Against which all their violence means nothing? Which neither fears death, nor can be stopped or killed by conventional means? It creates an inversion, where what the police represent means absolutely nothing, and therefore allows the audience to understand just how terrifying and overwhelming what they are witnessing truly is. The second movie carries this in a somewhat different, but adjacent direction. Rather than focusing on an overwhelming nightmare force of carnage and bloodshed, the prevailing theme of Judgment Day is far more subtle and sinister. Well, when I say more subtle, I'm ignoring Sarah's monologues and John's on-the-nose assertions. Not too far into the movie, we have the first thematic shift away from what the previous movie presented. Rather than subverting the power and authority that the police hold, it is fully inverted this time. The T-1000, assuming the guise of a police officer and utilizing the implicit and explicit authority which allows the police to act with impunity and without accountability, creates a fascinating and quite unsettling dynamic. This gives the audience an innate sense of distrust in a system we are always told is meant to protect us. Seems kinda familiar for some reason. This becomes the anchor of the fear and anxiety the movie drives home, everything expanding out from it. Unlike the threat of unstoppable carnage, the underlying theme here can be summed up by one word, an emotion that can be seen simmering under the surface of the entire movie. From Sarah's nightmares and the way she is treated in the asylum, to the way the T-1000 is so easily able to track John's whereabouts via a thin veneer of authority, the triumphs and breakthroughs of Cyberdyne's scientists juxtaposed against the horrors that such things will eventually lead to, the unrelenting dogma that Sarah has drilled into her son's psyche, treating him like the dark messiah of a future bereft of hope and light. And all of this is underpinned by the fact that not only is a new cold-blooded machine hunting down the supposed future savior of humanity, but this one can hide itself, impersonate those around you, betray your perception and trust in its single-minded drive to end your life. The word I'm referencing is paranoia. And this terrible foreboding for what the future might hold becomes apparent not through any direct narrative reference. Well, besides the obvious one. But rather the way it is woven throughout the entire narrative of both movies. Each time, the protagonists barely manage to drive this oppressive force away, only to live with the knowledge that it is ever present, lurking just beyond their perception. Whether it's Kyle Reese sent back to protect Sarah Connor, or a retrofitted T-101 sent back to protect John Connor, the picture that is painted is one of never-ending struggle, isolation, and despair. The story that is told is of a constant war against insurmountable odds, against an entity which will go so far as to send its agents through time itself to destroy that which poses a threat to it. Not much is known about or even shown of this emotionless nemesis, of this predatory god that thinks only in terms of its own existential need to crush any and all dissent. The full extent of the silent, creeping terror that exists just beyond the reach of current understanding doesn't even come from Skynet itself. It becomes apparent when Sarah, in utter desperation and hopelessness, tries to kill Miles Dyson before being stopped by her son. A moment of weakness where she comes to terms with who she has become and how she has alienated her own child. In those few moments, Sarah comes to realize just how far she has been driven by the shadow of this nightmarish spectre over the years. Miles comes to understand the almost alien horror of what his life's work, his greatest achievements, will unleash. And yet, despite the monolithic nemesis they face, in spite of the fact that no one else besides them understands, and that the apparatus of modern authority rails against them, despite the sacrifices that are made to prevent the coming of a future no one else can see, and risking everything they hold dear in order to defeat an implacable foe, they still push themselves to fight the future. And even then, the glimmer of hope created by their efforts, by the things they set in motion, are yet still uncertain. All they can do is learn from what has happened, learn to rely on each other, and face the unknown together. And then there's Terminator 3. Over the years of analysing Terminators 1 and 2, I've come to appreciate both movies more and more. But even when I watched the trilogy years ago as an empty-headed teenager, I knew that this movie was utter garbage. Now, I'm not about to give as deep an analysis of Rise of the Machines as the first two films, in part because I want to save you from that experience, but mostly because it would make me ill. But unlike the deep sense of terror and dread of the first film, or the foreboding fear of the future of the second, this one doesn't seem to know what the hell to do with itself. Instead, it languishes under the bloated weight of its own legacy, trundling along as a mass of half-formed, somewhat campy references used in an ill-fitting manner. Where T1 portrays the horror of having one's personal and intimate spaces invaded, T3 lowers itself to the level of banal and cheap slasher films. Where T1 shows the blooming of romance and connection in the face of shared trauma and hardship, T3 does whatever this is.
We made out in Kripke's basement. I cannot believe you remember that. Wow, I must have made some kind of impression.
Where T2 deals with the nuances of emotion and turmoil which the characters face when dealing with both each other and their present crisis, T3 mostly uses lazy and bland references to events past, while creating overly convenient plot points to try to tie this haphazard mess together into what is honestly a depressingly anticlimactic conclusion. I mean, even here, where the TX impersonates Catherine's boyfriend, couldn't the murder bot have just run up to her and given her the old shanky shank? Oh wow, that's a conveniently placed Chekhov's gun that has never once been mentioned in the series before. I hope someone doesn't shove it down our throats later on. I could spend the length of this entire video going into excruciating detail about how much Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines sucks, but I don't have that kind of time. Suffice to say, It sucks. Let's move on to two other movies that suck as well. I think the main problem with the three films that came after Judgment Day is that they treat the high-octane action of the series not as the vehicle for a deeper and more meaningful thought, but as the point of the entire series. I mean, that's probably why Terminator Salvation, which is somehow the best of the three movies that came after Judgment Day, doesn't have a plot. I mean, can anyone tell me what the point of this movie is? Because the only two noteworthy things that happen in this entire film are that the old hard-nosed leadership of the Resistance all fucking die, and John gets a new heart. That's it. And the stuff that leads up to these two events is convoluted. Now, I'm not going to get into too much detail, but are you telling me that the artificial superintelligence that is Skynet, a mastermind that has almost wiped humanity out, would actually come up with the bright idea of making a man-bot with free will and no true directives, along with giving it squishy, tender organs instead of durable machine parts? But don't worry.
You have a strong heart. The heart is human and very powerful.
That's important for later. And of course, healthy heapings of either utterly pointless references or, oh, well gee, would you look at that? A bunch of conveniently placed plot devices. Neat!
Kate. Take mine.
You see? I told you that would be important later. Not to mention all the build-up at the beginning towards narrative elements that, like I said, are just pointless references and... I wonder how much Terry Crews was paid to appear dead on screen for 5 seconds. Anyway. Now if you think Terminator Salvation is convoluted, oh boy have I got a treat for you. Where to begin? You know, I think Terminator Genesis could have been a pretty good movie.
Nice to see you. Get out.
It could have been a slightly above average movie, if not for the absurdly complex plot, which I have to assume was at least partially inspired by the Sarah Connor Chronicles TV series. And honestly, if by now this doesn't look like an episode of Cinema Sins, it's about to. Are you telling me that Sarah and Dadbot over here built a time machine in a goddamn basement
With a box of scraps!
while cyborg John Connor, powered by Skynet and funded by a billion-dollar tech company, somehow can't do the same in a few years? Ding! No. No, 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 no. We're not doing that. I'm better than that. But still, someone had the bright idea of taking what has been up to this point in the franchise, a simple plot device to move the narrative forward, that being time travel, and turned it into the entire point of the movie.
Listen to me, Reese, everything's changed. The 1984 John sent you to, it no longer exists.
If the past can change, then so can the future.
So you're remembering the future?
No. The boy is the alternate timeline version of you. Kyle Reese is remembering his own past, which is our future.
Which ends up creating a narrative so mind-numbingly convoluted that it requires this.
How can he be remembering two timelines?
It is possible if you were exposed to a nexus point in the time flow when you were in a quantum field. A nexus point is an event in time of such importance that it gives rise to a vastly different future. If John Connor were to be killed or compromised, it could result in the ability to remember both pasts. Theoretically.
To bring it all together. Well, at least it's not completely terrible. There are a few cool concepts that play out, along with a contrived and weird romance subplot, Cliched exposition, pointless arguments with holograms, a very large explosion which conveniently destroys just enough to solve the immediate problem but leaves just enough so we can have some open-ended future potential. Okay, I have to be honest. It is terrible. And now we come to the last chapter. To be perfectly honest, I was actually a little scared to watch the latest Terminator movie. I've been hurt so many times. But to my utter shock, Terminator Dark Fate is not a terrible movie. It's actually pretty good. Is Dark Fate a better movie than the first two? Maybe not. But it's close. And it achieves this not by simply using references and previously established tropes, or in some cases, inverting them.
I won't be back.
But by understanding why those things are there in the first place. Yes, there are a few instances where one can see the clear parallels, whether those are subtle nods or more deliberate homages, but this is always in full service to the greater narrative, rather than being pointless fan service. The feelings of dread and paranoia at having something grotesque yet just familiar enough to be unnerving invade the comfort and safety of your life, distorting your perception of the world around you. The terror of facing against a being of cold and brutal calculation, which doesn't hunger or thirst or need rest and cannot possibly be reasoned with. The hopelessness of knowing that you have to keep running, that you have to keep moving because to stop means almost certain death at the hands of something you barely understand. The stress and trauma which leads to moments of heartbreaking anguish and genuine connection. The determination which drives the protagonists forward, having hope in a slim chance of an uncertain victory in the face of an overwhelming foe. All of the primary themes that allowed the first two movies to transcend being mere action films are here. And yet, it still manages to be a wholly unique experience. One which I will not be delving deeply into, and for a simple reason. If you're a fan of 1984's The Terminator, and 1991's Terminator Judgment Day, and you haven't yet watched 2019's Terminator Dark Fate, you need to. Forget everything that came between. This is the true final film that brings everything to its conclusion. The actual trilogy that we were meant to have. This is the grand third act of a story which was started nearly 40 years ago. A narrative which has finally found completion. And as you will realize once you've watched it, it's also the closing chapter of Sarah's story. In conclusion, the entire narrative of these three films combined tells a story that is more than just the excitement and thrill we usually get from movies within the action genre. It's a story of the hopelessness and terror felt when facing something all-consuming and seemingly unstoppable, yet not losing yourself and your humanity to those feelings. Of facing threats of an existential nature and holding on to that sliver of hope. Even knowing that overcoming the ordeals of today won't make the hardships of tomorrow disappear. Yet you push forward, you keep moving, holding dear to what you cherish, and fighting tooth and nail against the inevitable. It is a very human story, in raw and agonizing detail. To face the fire, and to fight against fate, in order to hold on to the small but profound hope of a better tomorrow. Hope you enjoyed my deep and overly complex analysis. I really poured a lot of time into writing the script and making this video. I know I mentioned the Terminator TV show, but the reason why I didn't include it in this video is because I don't really feel it fits with what I'm aiming for here. However, if you folks are interested in such a video, let me know in the comments and I'll see if I can get it around to it in maybe a month or so. If you liked it, well, give it a like and subscribe to see when next I post a video. Until next time,
I'll be back.